Spring comes late at sea and along the shoreline, and when it does come, it's subtle. To see this season in its richness, its fullness of life, we have to turn inland. This is Rill Swamp on Phillip Island off the southern coast of Australia. During the season, the swamp is a rich experience of life, of texture, movement, colour. White ibis nest and the magnificent royal spoonbill, and the bush is full of small birds and other creatures. The melaleuca flowers and the tattered bark hangs over the water. Everywhere there is dapple and splash and movement and reflections. Frog spawn lies on the surface, and reeds bend down into their own reflections. Under the trees it's cool, but the air is filled with the scent of melaleuca honey. Pied cormorant gazes rather apprehensively down at the human intruder. There aren't many visitors to the swamp, and most of the birds were relatively tame. The sound of frogs and small birds singing in the thickets were a continual background to all the activities. Here's a royal spoonbill gazing down out of his treetop sanctuary. These are the most striking bird perhaps in the whole swamp, with their fine crest and their black bill and their pink eyebrow. dead trees are killed by the perching ibis and spoonbills. They spend so much time in the treetops that they break off the leafing twigs. Nature's way of stopping the swamp from becoming too thick. Down below the nesting cormorants and spoonbills, the ibis build their stick platforms and lay their 3 or 4 eggs in the spring. These young birds are a couple of weeks old, I should say, covered in white down. They're black heads and short hooked bills. These are straw-necked ibis, a less common bird in the swamp. The young birds often fall out, but they apparently can swim quite well. I've seen 1 or 2 of them struggling across the top of the water and pulling themselves out on the tangles of dead twigs at the bottom of each tree. There's a magnificent royal spoonbill with his crest blowing up in the wind. In the depths of the swamp, we built a hide on a tall tower so that we could get up amongst the treetops and really see what was going on in that very special bird world that exists up there. It's hard to imagine now, with all this water about, that 40 years ago this whole swamp was on fire. For weeks the trees burnt, and later the underground peat smouldered, and when the rains came it steamed for another month. Bill Barrett, who looks after this place, tells me that that was the first time for about 100 years that the swamp had become dry, so they took the opportunity to deepen some of these pools with bulldozers and drag out the timber from some of the channels, making it a much more suitable place for the breeding water birds. It's a nice change to see man making a haven for birds rather than destroying one. And here, in this treetop haven, is a scene of bustling domesticity. Young cormorants waggling their poor, thin little necks, begging for food from a parent that hasn't arrived yet. Now here's a pair of young cormorants stroking their mother's throat to make her regurgitate the pilchards or whatever she's bringing in. Royal spoonbills again, surely the most elegant and yet bizarre bird of the whole of Australia. Incredible creatures. That great spoon on the end of the bill is used for exactly that purpose, spooning up the insects and small crustaceans off the surface. Ibis being driven off by a display there from a spoonbill. That dark mark under their wing is a bare piece of very scarlet flesh that glows very brightly in the breeding season. It's always remarkable to me that these great birds can perch in trees. There's a beautiful portrait. These are young spoonbills. You can see just the beginning of the swelling there, but they haven't yet turned dark in the bill. A pair of peaceful neighbours, pied cormorant and a preening spoonbill. These little pied cormorants feed in the water, the fresh water down below, but they also go out to sea and fish along the coastline a few miles off. Oh, hello, Bill. Shan't be a moment. That's Bill Barrett that I was talking about before from the Fishes and Wildlife Department. I'm going with him now, and he's going to guide us around the channels of this rather intricate swamp, and we can have a closer look at all the beautiful birds. I'd like to go around the back of these bushes here. Oh, yeah. You put your brakes on now. And dig. And how deep would we be here now?
Oh, about 3 to 4 feet, where the channels are.
And this is where you bulldozed?
Yes. We came in from that direction. Bulldozed down the deeper part of the swamp, mainly made islands down there. We just pushed the timber up here to make it easier to get around in. You could hardly walk through this. Dead timber on the bottom for years and years.
Oh, was there? It wasn't all open like this? You've organised
No, it was all dead.
Mm.
That's one of the heaps of dead stuff there now, see. We pushed this dead stuff up in the shallow so that any ducklings and that caught out in the open water, anything attacked them, they could just swim in underneath. All dead, loose timber.
That's right.
That's the dead timber. See, the reeds are going up through it to make terrific cover.
Yeah, it looks beautiful. Make a nice paint.
Look at the size of that. Peaceful now, isn't it?
You getting blisters?
Nah.
I don't suppose you do.
Cormorant there.
There's that white marker stick. The channel. I could sit out here all day. Above the treetops all day there's a bustle of activity. The spoonbills and ibis coming in to change duties at the nest, bringing in food, going off for a feed for themselves. Altercations, domestic squabbles. The spoonbills fly most magnificently and they appear to be using their great beak as a rudder, a kind of a forward rudder. Sweeping and turning against the blue sky. They really are the most delightful creatures. Banding has showed that some of these ducks fly very far afield. And if, like them, we explore out from the Rule Swamp in the south of Victoria, we will come to, on the far northern boundary, a very different kind of a swamp. A flooded red gum forest, which is a long way north. It's on the great river, the Murray. Our arrival is heralded by the little corellas that fly shrieking out of the treetops. This is the short-billed variety. It's a relative of the better-known white cockatoo, the sulphur-crested cockatoo. They have a flush of pink around their face and a strange bare eye patch of skin. ever watchful and ever noisy. At first sight, the flooded red gum forest is not unlike rill, the same dappled textures, the same shallow water around the edges, same sedgy growth. Penetrating further in, over the levee banks, we find a very deeper, more mysterious scene. Here's the wood duck, or maned goose as some people call him. These feed on the few grassy banks that are left above the floodline. This is the beautiful Barmah Forest. Bordering the Murray, a few miles upstream from Echuca, the forest is usually flooded once or twice a year. At these times, the forest is flooded to depths up to 10 or 12 feet. Swollen by rains or snow thaw in the high country to the east, the river spreads out through the red gum forest. The interior of the forest is accessible then only by boat. And the spring floods make the whole area an ideal breeding ground for wildfowl and water birds of all kinds. As spring advances and the water warms up, we find a disturbing abundance of snakes. A few copperheads, a few handsome red-bellied black snakes like this one here, and hundreds of the deadly tiger snake. This is the outer skin of a rather large black snake, left here where the reptile has crawled out onto this gnarled old gum log to slough off its winter skin and take on its sleek black summer skin. There was a time, of course, when the Aborigines hunted through this forest. They set fire to the fallen tangles of scrub and the low bushes to drive out the reptiles and small mammals of various kinds upon which they fed. There are still signs like this old burnt stump of their having passed this way. About the 1870s, the white man came and the stockmen moved in with their herds, and the black man departed. These grey foresters would have been a chief part of the Aborigines' prey, I would think. A beautiful animal which now is not hunted much in this forest. The chief hardship they have to endure is being stranded and going a little bit hungry on the few ridges of high country left when the river comes down and floods the forest. Indeed, a beautiful animal in a beautiful setting. Straw-necked ibis dropping into his perch. Extraordinary stretches of flooded trees and varieties of textures. In amongst the reeds, the coot and the duck nest, and I found that swimming out to look at their eggs was not always an advisable thing to do. Tangled with a very alarming black snake. Above all this excitement is the serene, gliding pelican, the largest bird in the forest. They spend a lot of time circling like this in the hot currents of air rising up over the open water. To get the best out of the forest, you really need a guide. It's so enormous.
Yeah.
Morning, Tom.
How are you?
Pretty good. How are you?
All right.
Can you reach?
Yeah, up you.
I'm glad you're here. I keep getting lost.
That wouldn't be anything new, would it?
Not in this forest, would it? Just give us a push off and we'll go and see what we can find. I suppose it'd be hard to find a better guide than Tom Galloway. Tom has been in this forest since he was a boy. In fact, he was first taken around it by an old Aborigine friend of his. And they spent many, many hours exploring it and bird nesting and learning the way of the flooded forest. Tom's been a herdsman here and he's presently employed by the Forest Commission. And there are probably a few men who know the place better. There's the ever wary white-faced heron going over the treetops. Some of these old red gums are quite impressive in their size. There's a coot's nest with its 5 eggs. It is said an old river red gum would be responsible for casting something like 150 million seeds in its lifetime. Of course, very few of these germinate. They mostly go to be food for the insects and small mammals. As you can see, there's not much bird life out on the wide wastes of the open water. In the shallower parts, we find more birds. White-faced heron again. This is where their food is. Straw-necked ibis. It drops the heron in to feed on the muddy edge of a paddock. Most of the forest is fenced off for stock. Interesting to see here the different feeding technique. The ibis continually probing away in the mud there, snapping up all sorts of minute things, and the heron just stabbing occasionally at something larger. Plover, excited by the warm spring weather. And here comes a galah to drink. Extraordinarily beautiful bird in its pink and grey plumage. Dark, knowing eye. There's an interesting action here with the spurwing plover. He dabbles away at the ground there with one foot, and apparently the vibrations must drive the small insects up and the worms to the surface of the earth. And they do the same thing in the water to stir it up. dabbling away there again. Very queer little action. Seems to be most effective. On here's a small inland wader, the black-fronted dotterel, one of the few waders that you find that don't haunt the beaches. Very smart little chap. A closer look at the wood duck that we saw before flying off into the forest. This bird is a strange sort of aberrant duck. It's halfway between a duck and a goose. You can see the goose-like head, and they graze like a goose. They're very smart in their silvery grey plumage. A pair of teal dropping in, a shy, wary bird in marbled brown plumage. There's a closer look at them. They feed all day in the shallows and spend the nights feeding sometimes too when it's warm and the conditions are right. There they go, frightened off by the alarm call of the cockatoos. It'd be hard to sum up in one drawing the spirit of the two swamps of Rill and Barmer, but I suppose hardly do better than my favourite bird, the royal spoonbill.